Subnautica, Subnautica, whatever you want to call it, and needless to say, the indie dev team Unknown World's latest release has become a success. And while Subnautica has always been at least semi-popular since the very first build back in December 2014, then after 3 years the game has finally reached the 1% of all achievable goals by early access games, actually getting out of early access. That means the game is now finally in a state where we can review it, discuss it, and criticize it without the "it's not even out yet" argument being dumped on the table. Also reminding me to 1. Inform you that this is a criticism, not a review. Reviews are meant to help you decide whether or not if you should buy something, where videos like this one usually discuss what was done right in the game and what could be done better next time. And 2nd, to remind you all that all critique is based on my experience of playing the game half a month after it's released. This is just to inform you that you can't use the "it's not hot fixed yet" argument either. That being said, then let's dive into it, pun intended. As previously mentioned, then the game was initially in early access, which to be honest put me off quite a bit when I first looked at Subnautica. And that's because at the time there were tons of developers that were exploiting the early access feature on Steam. But I immediately want to give props to these developers, who all seem very passionate about the project and even kept going when the team was facing potential bankruptcy, almost exclusively running on determination and a bunch of nice publicity from YouTubers. The state of the game and the entire team have been through quite a rough ride, but in the end then they managed to achieve a finished version. Because that's what it feels like, especially compared to those other games that attempted to execute the same sort of idea, then it feels finished. Which might not actually sound like quite a lot, but it is. See, a very common issue with these kind of open world survival games is that usually either the devs are lying money greedy douches from the get-go, or then they're way too ambitious and bite more than they can chew by promising big and only barely managing to deliver on the promise by corner cutting the game to no end. No Man's Sky is a brilliant example of this. It promised so much, so fleshed out, so detailed, and so grand, and either the developers lied or unintentionally overestimated themselves, making false promises, letting everyone down as they only managed to barely finish some simple core gameplay. This is likely because they panically dropped everything else just to finish what was most important, in a desperate attempt to lessen the damage from the inevitable consumer disappointment. This is where Unknown World executed the whole process pretty well, actually. Even though they pushed the deadline quite a few times and ran into quite a bit of bumps, then they managed to keep the project somewhat realistic and within their horizon of both resources and time and money. Somewhat. Sure, they could have corner cut quite a bit and made more areas instead of better areas, or sacrificed parts of the game entirely to avoid pushing the deadline, but they didn't. Determination and quality over quantity seem to be some of the core elements that run this team, or at least that's what it seems like to me. But this doesn't mean the game is executed perfectly in that sense, not by a long shot. The devs definitely did an amazing job compared to the many previously failed attempts of other teams, but weirdly enough then there's still quite a lot of very basic parts of the game that deserve some attention when it comes to prioritizing on the developer side. I consider myself a big fan of detail, and I like how Unknown Worlds stick with making their details despite being behind schedule, where other devs would likely have just dropped them on a whim. But as I've played the game myself, I've grown quite a bit concerned about how the team prioritizes what needs to be done. And that is not to be quick about expanding on what they've already added to the game, but make the experience they already made more stable and easily playable. Or should I say, you did a lot to the areas to make them look good, but in a lot of cases you didn't make them work very well. Subnautica is still very buggy and not very well optimized, and while it is certainly not anywhere near as bad as in some of the mid-early access builds, and is expected to bug out from time to time, especially this shortly after release, then not including the fact that there are still some parts of the game that still consistently break immersion, like the seafloor rendering weirdly close to you no matter how you adjust the graphics, and frame drops still being quite common, then I've experienced a few pretty experience-breaking experiences in just a couple of hours playtime. In my case, then both of those issues ended up messing with the Cyclops, but I'm sure there are plenty more. The Cyclops is the player's mobile base of a submarine that is not only expensive on its own, but with upgrades and storage for tons of gathered materials, then it is easily infuriating if something messes it up unreasonably. The first issue consisted of my Cyclops being literally pinball knocked upside down by a giant reefback flying out of the stuck position in the seafloor. Luckily then this issue didn't affect my game that badly, except making me reload to unstuck my weirdly positioned Cyclops and giving me a small heart attack. The other issue upset me quite a bit more though, but wasn't as much of an issue with the actual Cyclops, but actually the destroyed version. To explain the context, then I was just having a jolly good time in Subnautica, cruising along in my giant, until then near invincible submarine, when I reached a supposedly ecologically dead zone, as my HUD was so nice to inform me. Now it's a funny joke, I get it, Ghost Leviathan and ecologically dead, I get it. But it makes me laugh a whole lot less when it costs me my Cyclops, prawn suit, and probably a bit of my lifespan, as I nearly relieved myself when the ship suddenly got mauled by 3 of these bastards. The only actual warning of their mistake of an existence being tucked nicely under the data entry they expect me to read at every possible opportunity as a side note. There's a steep decline all around, and helps prove our theory that the ship has landed on a crater which created proper conditions for a flourishing ecosystem. Isn't that interesting? Oh, by the way, death! So needless to say, I was pretty upset and felt like I kinda got the short end of the stick with that pretty unfair seeming treatment. But I'd say the real unfairness occurs when I try to go back to the destroyed Cyclops with my sea moth to salvage some of the gathered material stored in the wreck. Now this isn't as stupid as it sounds. When I was in the thick of it, I made it close enough to safe waters with the Cyclops, only slightly hovering above the dead drop, but simply didn't manage to repair or get out of the ship before it exploded on me. So salvage run should have been pretty easy, and it seemed to be so because the wreck was hovering right where I left it. Now, if you know the game, then you already know something's up. The wreck of a Cyclops usually doesn't hover, but sinks. But at the time I thought it was just a nice feature added in to avoid messing with the players too much, seeing as they'd already lost a pretty valuable vehicle. But as I entered the ship, I didn't really touch it, and only made contact with it on a doorframe in the front of the ship. This suddenly activated the physics of the wreck, sending it straight down to the depths with me in it, only grinding to a halt at 1700 meters when it got scissored between some cliffs, obviously killing me and leaving me to slowly swim 2 kilometers just to get my Seamoth back. Needless to say, I didn't really pick up the game a couple of days after that. Sorry about the rant, but I feel like it's kind of important to underline that this is an issue that is much more relevant in a game like Subnautica. In other games there are tons of autosaves, and reloading doesn't have much effect, and while the player usually loses some progression, then it isn't a large enough amount to ruin an experience for the player, usually. But in Subnautica, where the player simply being forgetful can end up leaving them with save points hours apart, and where progression is so easily lost, which is actually one of the things that makes Subnautica fun, the fact that there's a risk, then it's really important that the player feels it's completely their own fault if they lose that progress. That they took a risk and loss and didn't lose unfairly because the game said so. And I did not feel that way when I was on the border of the map, especially not after almost being nearly comforted into thinking there was nothing out there by the HUD message. But those are simply some of the very few notable issues that I've run into. Heck, even if we're discussing the bug with the pinball reefback and the floaty wreck, then of course it should be looked into, but there is a solid chance that I just got really unlucky during my playthrough. It's not like I'm saying this is a consistent issue that will necessarily plague your game, but it's important and should absolutely be the first priority for the developers to make sure that it won't. In fact, then for the most part they actually do a very good job at hitting the player. This is mostly thanks to a lot of the game's great sound and music. The soundtrack composer did an undeniably great job, even though he was fired from the team for completely justified reasons, and that people who try to support him by yelling infringement on free speech don't know that free speech isn't free of consequence. The soundtrack composer did an undeniably great job with the game. For me, then, it's one of the only soundtracks that immediately come to mind when I think of electronica background game music. It works so well with the alien sci-fi theme and is really effective at warning you or even kicking your butt into gear when stuff gets serious. Like when a fire starts on a ship or monsters nearby. Even listening to the music when you enter a new area can help you get a feeling about how dangerous it is, which is good. You can kick your butt into gear, that's for sure, but sometimes it can also go a little over the top, sometimes making me feel like I accidentally tripped onto the club dance floor. To me, then the soundtrack works best in its subtlety, maintaining that futuristic sense of alien or unknown without interrupting the gameplay too much. Or even by cutting out the music entirely so we can hear the other part of the soundtrack, the actual sounds of the environment and its creatures. It's why we fear space, it's why we fear the idea of being deep down in dark open water not knowing what's out there. And it's why Unknown Worlds made a combination of those two. I also believe that's why there's very limited weapons in the game, and while it is possible to kill the big creatures by stabbing them slowly to death, then it's likely not what the developers hope you spend your time focusing on. Instead, then to me it seems like you're supposed to learn. Learn, gather data, and adapt to the world around you. If you're like me, then you fled from the stalkers at first, and now because you know they're near harmless, you mostly ignore them. You're supposed to learn how to adapt to things you don't know about. This sound is probably one of, if not my favorite, creature sound in the game. As a player, then when you hear this sound in the game, you can't recognize it from anywhere. You try to run it through your memory, trying to bind it to something you know, but you likely won't find any creatures to bind this to. It's truly foreign. And this means you don't know how to react to it, how much of a threat it poses, what it's capable of, or even if it's dangerous at all. That's the intense fear of the unknown you want to achieve, sound-wise at least. Some other examples of not as good, but pretty good sound effects that consist of the Ghost Leviathan's roar and the Sea Treader's slow-motion Chewbacca yell. My only problem with this sound design in this game is that there isn't enough of it. A lot of creatures, especially the aggressive ones, don't have this type of sound design, but instead go for the typically easy to tell aggression dinosaur monster noises, making a lot of them unmemorable as creatures because they're so easily recognized from our real world or other fiction. Dangerous monster noise? Check. Dinosaur-like design? Check. Done. All there is to it. An aggressive, swimming dinosaur. This is also the part of the critique where I'd like to talk about the creature that feels most out of place in this game to me. The Sea Dragon. I feel kind of uncomfortable talking about this one because I feel like I'm gonna get a lot of backlash for it since it means so much to the game. It's obvious that the developers did their hardest trying to make this thing intimidating and scary, and it is to some degree. But that's mostly primarily thanks to its size and loudness. The problem lies in the idea of the creature design itself, not how it was actually stitched together. It's pretty boring. Creatures like the Crab Snake, Warper, and the Reaper Leviathan might have some pretty easily categorizable sound designs, but make up for it with their amazing, completely otherworldly and creative visual designs. The River Prowler, the Lava Lizard, the Bone Shark, and last but not least the Sea Dragon all lack in this department. But the main problem is the Sea Dragon here. The other creatures are okay to have in the world. They play the role of simple threats, things you're supposed to avoid. But the Sea Dragon takes the role as the largest, most intimidating threat in the entire game. The last huge danger standing between the player and their ending. It's important that this design works and intimidates the player. It's supposed to be the send-off as the most terrifying last thing the game has to offer. And it's a two-creature combo that sounds like a loud T-Rex, with a dragon-top body and an underbody that justifies it being underwater in some way. One of the only ways this could have been less creative design-wise, to me at least, would have been if they had a dolphin tail instead of a squid. Actually no, because it already looks like something that's in the game. It simply looks like an aggressive version of the Emperor Leviathan. Are they supposed to be related? I know this is likely justified in the lore somehow, like the environment forcing that evolution or something like that. But to me, then it just doesn't justify that the two biggest and arguably most important creatures look really similar, and that the biggest dangerous creature isn't anywhere near otherworldly terrifying. The theme that's been going on for the entire game. That being said, then there isn't much to be done about it at this point. Tons of effort has already been invested in making the Sea Dragon and making it as intimidating as they could, and while that might be disappointing to some, at least to me, then it's not a call to action. Remember, this is not a video about what I want the future of Subnautica to be, even though I did point out some things that could improve the game as of now. Then remember, the point of this video is to simply discuss what parts of the game was great, how it could have been better, and what to keep in mind in the future. In fact, I've already finished my playthrough, and even though I know there's a lot left for players to do in the game, and likely will return to, then I don't see myself returning to the game anytime soon. That's nothing to do with the game, that's just how I play games. I play them, I finish them, and then I move on to play more games. It's not that I don't like this game at all. Don't twist my words to that. The game definitely deserves all the praise it's getting, but once again, it's getting a lot of praise. The only thing I found hard to find about the game is criticism, or how to make it better, which is why I decided to challenge myself by making this video. Initially I didn't even think I had that much to rant about, but this script just suddenly ended up being a lot longer than I'd initially planned. Which is also why there's a bunch of things I would like to have discussed that I liked about the game, like how that story waypoints guide you to new areas and stuff like that. But to save myself the editing nightmare and making the video at least somewhat short and consumable for you guys, then I decided to stick almost solely to the critique. Not that there's not a lot of good stuff to say about it, but just because I don't have time to talk about that. That also just reminded me that I should probably just wrap up now instead of wasting more of my time discussing how I'm cutting time. Stupid. Anyway, thank you guys for watching this very negative Nancy focused video. It has been a while in the making and it took me a lot of time to write the script, but didn't really have time to mash any good stuff in there, so sorry it sounds a little negative, but I hope you liked it anyway. Once again, thank you, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.